Welcome. We're going to go over Chapter 7 in the AP US History class here. It's Mr. Everett. I hope you guys are having a good weekend. So what I'm going to do here is take you through a video lecture on the notes concerning Chapter 7 in your textbook. I'm going to do this for a few other chapters as well in order to make sure we go through all the material and keep ourselves on pace. So let's get right into it. The chapter is called The Road to Revolution, and it's an interesting point in American history because we begin to see the coalition here of many different forces in the aftermath of the French and Indian War. And ultimately we know that what happens is many of these different forces on the American colonial side begin to speak one common message, and that's a message that's growing, not fully there yet, but growing towards the idea of revolution. But first, we encounter the beginnings of a protest movement. So let's talk a little bit about how this chapter starts. So in the chapter introduction, there are a couple important points that your book points out about the end results of the French and Indian War. And we know that while the British obtained a great deal of land and imperial power in North America, they're saddled with enormous debt. So your book points out something that I'd like to focus on here, and that is that the eventual conflict in the colonies was not inevitable. And even though it's true that we look at events from a point of causation in the study of history, it's not true that causation leads to inevitability. Just because we know that certain events lead to other events does not mean that those events, the ones that are effects themselves, are inevitable. We'll talk a little bit more about this throughout the rest of all the different subjects and topics that we'll be addressing here in this class. So, in the first section here, concerning the deep roots of revolution, your book begins to talk about two main points, and I'd like to focus on them. These are some of the ideological foundations on which what we would later know as American democracy begin to take shape. And one is this Enlightenment idea of republicanism. And your book points this out, and I think it's careful to take a look at the language that's used here. That exponents of republicanism defined a just society as one in which all citizens willingly subordinated their private self-interests to the common good. Both the stability of society and the authority of the government thus depended on the virtue of its citizenry, its capacity for selflessness, self-sufficiency, and courage, and especially its appetite for civic involvement. By its very nature, republicanism was opposed to hierarchical and authoritarian institutions such as aristocracy and monarchy. Now, we'll be talking a little bit more about these events as America begins to form its first constitution, called the Articles of Confederation, towards the end and later into the period after the Revolutionary War. But in this beginning period, it's important to take a look at Republicanism requires the stability of society focused on the common good, and individual private and self-interest can't get in the way of that. And the authority of government, it depends on people being virtuous, selfless, self-sufficient, and courageous, and civically involved. Now, all of these are general terms, and they don't necessarily point to individual actions. So when we say civic involvement, that could mean, protesting in the streets. When we talk about the common good, that could mean freedom for slaves in the South. And when we talk about the idea of selflessness, that could specifically refer to this idea that the individual is not as important as the group. So I'd like to point that out. That plays an important role as events develop. And the second is these internal developments in England during this period. There was a party known as the Whig Party. And they personally, during this period of salutary neglect, reinforced the idea that the colonies would be most prosperous, I should say, if left on their own. And they feared, the Whig Party in particular, a threat to liberty posed by the arbitrary power of the monarch and his ministers relative to the elected representatives in Parliament. So you see that there's this dual system in England during this period. Parliament has elected representatives, but there's arbitrary power in the monarch. It seems almost a little bipolar, from a political point of view. And when we begin to see where the colonists direct all of their anger, it's not really at Parliament per se, but the king and his advisors, and what they determine the colonists to be the arbitrary use of power. So let's get into it. Mercantilism. We've talked about this a great deal in the class, and I'd like to point out a few things. One, to amass gold and silver, a country needed to export more than it imported. And this is a goal or an objective of the British. The colonies we did mention in class, they supply raw materials, but they also guarantee markets for exports. And actually, it's that guaranteed market that plays a stronger role than the production of raw materials. Because we'll see later when non-importation agreements begin to become signed and enforced in the colonies, that really hurts the British more than the idea of raw materials being cut off. So, the problems with mercantilism for the colonists, well, I mean, from this period of salutary neglect, the navigation laws were only loosely enforced. Okay, they weren't really a big threat. We know that tobacco planters, they did enjoy a monopoly, and the colonists enjoyed the protection of the world's mightiest navy. I mean, these all reinforce the idea that mercantilism wasn't really by itself a flawed economic system, and that the colonies did prosper during this period. And we know that because of the high standard of living, the population explosion, and the large number of people who are coming to the colonies, both from Britain as well as Scotland and Ireland and Germany as well. So the bigger argument, and this is one that I pointed out in class when we went over notes that John Adams used to argue against Parliament's authority over the colonies, was that there was this sense that the British government was keeping the colonies in this period of adolescence. They weren't allowing economic prosperity to grow. And your book does point out a small little passage here by Adam Smith that I did want to make mention to, because it would be Adam Smith in 1776 that would publish one of the most important books in the history of the world. It would be known as The Wealth of Nations. And in that, he would argue for the creation of a capitalist system built on a division of labor. And he would cite the colonies specifically in many examples in his book. So, the Stamp Act, okay, it really creates a problem in the colonies. One, because first, I should point out that the British, of course, were in debt from the French and Indian War. But the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act that preceded it did encourage protests. And from the protests of 1764, we see that Parliament responded by lowering duties. Those were the amounts that the colonists had to pay on sugar that was imported from the Caribbean. The British passed a Quartering Act in 1765 that the colonists had to provide food and a bed for British troops that were sent there to enforce the laws that the colonists didn't want. Ultimately, we come to this point of the stamp tax, which is specifically designed to raise revenue. There were about 50 trade items that were listed here, as well as playing cards, pamphlets, newspapers, diplomas, bills of landing, and marriage licenses. All of these are necessary in the function of government in the colonies. So your book points out that the British people had been paying a stamp tax for 2 generations, and their taxes were actually significantly higher than the colonists' taxes. Although colonial assemblies defiantly refused to comply with the Quartering Act, and later we'll see they refuse to comply with the Stamp Act, that becomes a big issue because the British, in order to help enforce this, create what they call admiralty courts, in which the defendant was assumed guilty until proven innocent. This idea of trial by jury, okay, and innocent proven until proven guilty, were violated by the British during this period, and ultimately we see that James Otis helps to create this idea of no taxation without representation, which is, of course, a distinction that the colonists were really specific about. It's ironic. I mean, the colonists don't really want representation. They just want no taxation because, of course, if they were represented in Parliament, they would be outvoted. The British government claims that the colonists will be virtually represented instead of directly represented in Parliament. And this plays into the hands of the Americans, who are looking for, some of them, excuses to create this growing movement against British imperial authority. Now, I want you to think about the outcome here, because the Stamp Acts, specifically led by the House of Burgesses and later other colonial assemblies, specifically Patrick Henry, they complain that, that there's this problem with taxation, but they draw a distinction here between taxation and legislation, and that's something that's important because, the colonial assemblies did tax the colonists as well, and the colonists didn't have a problem with that. It was the problem with this sense of representation, which again gets into the irony here because that wasn't ultimately a goal. So we do move on, okay? The British government repeals the Stamp Act after the Stamp Act Congress, even though 27 people were elected to it, as your book points out, it didn't really make an influence over the British Parliament. What did make an influence was this idea of protest, and specifically a threat that would influence trade. So we get to that point because non-importation agreements begin to really hurt the British. And I want to make a distinction here between a boycott and non-importation. So if you boycott something, like if you learn that Nike sneakers, as was in the early 1990s, were made by child labor, then you could refuse to buy the sneakers, and that would ultimately hurt the company. But non-importation is not a boycott. So the colonial assemblies, as well as self-represented groups like the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, they agreed that merchants weren't going to import British goods. So in other words, consumers in the colonies wouldn't even have a choice. The merchants themselves agreed that they wouldn't bring the British goods here, and their goal was to get the suppliers and the manufacturers of these goods, like finished metal goods and equipment that was needed for farming. The producers and suppliers of these goods would pressure Parliament back in England, and they would push the Stamp Act towards this. So boycotts, petitions, assemblies, all of these were important in organizing the colonists, but they weren't necessarily important in shifting Parliament's mind. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the developments from the Stamp Act onto the early revolutionary period in part 2, and I'll see you in a little bit.